You were never meant to be my equal.
Then I'll ask for nothing more.
This marriage is only duty. Kyle, this is not your war. Stay back!
The moment I became your husband, it became my war.
If you go out there, you'll die.
No, Valora, they will.
Kyle, what are you?
Your husband.
No, more than that.
A war god.
The ceremony lasted 47 minutes, which Marcus Rowe considered either efficient or tragic, depending on how you felt about the 38 years that had preceded it. He stood in borrowed dress grays the Galactic Council's logistics division had provided them, because apparently the planning committee that arranged interspecies diplomatic marriages had not thought to ask the man they were marrying off whether he owned anything suitable and listened to the officiant recite binding vows in 3 languages. Marcus understood 2 of them. The third was listed in his briefing materials as ceremonial Anthori High Register, which he'd been told was largely symbolic and probably fine. He had made a private note to read the full transcript later, because in his experience, the things you were told were probably fine were exactly the things most likely to become legally significant at inconvenient moments. I've survived 3 wars, 2 border skirmishes, and a court-martial, he had said to Admiral Ewan when she delivered the assignment 3 weeks prior, in a briefing room on Callisto Station that smelled like recycled air and repurposed ambition. A wedding should be easy. Ewan had given him the look she reserved for statements that were technically accurate and completely beside the point. You're not being asked to survive it. Colonel, you're being asked to be presentable, to represent the United Earth Councils in a manner that does not result in 3 parallel treaty negotiations collapsing simultaneously. A pause, also to occasionally smile. Those are different skill sets. Marcus, I'll smile. He was managing the presentable part, at least marginally, the 43 gray hairs at his temples, each of them earned individually in the Kreth Ve border campaigns. Read as distinguished from a distance rather than exhausted. The scar along his jaw from the Pelorum engagement was covered by his collar. He'd shaved. He was standing straight. He had even, and he considered this a genuine act of diplomacy, not yet made any jokes. The woman he was marrying wasn't looking at him. Velshari Kianthara, 3rd Heer of the Anthori High Conclave, diplomatic envoy to the Galactic Council. And now, according to the registry processing in the background, his wife stood approximately 3 inches taller than Marcus and used every one of those inches to examine a point several centimeters above his head, as though the wall behind him contained information of actual diplomatic significance. She had 4 arms, 2 primary ones crossed in what his briefing materials called neutral posture, low engagement, non-hostile, and 2 smaller secondary arms folded against her lower torso in the Anthori equivalent of hands in pockets, except communicating considerably more control. Her skin was the blue-gray of deep-water ice, the bioluminescent markings that ran along her neck, collarbone, and down her primary forearms were a steady, unvarying, absolutely tranquil, cool blue. Indifferent, he decided, possibly mildly inconvenienced. The diplomatic team had given him 40 pages of briefing on Anthori bioluminescent communication, which he had read twice on the transport and once more at 3 in the morning in his Nexus station quarters. And the steady, cool blue was the emotional equivalent of a system set to maintenance mode present. Processing, performing its function, not particularly exercised about any of it. The officiant concluded the vows and moved to the exchange of seals. Not rings, Anthori didn't do rings. His briefing had explained at some length. The Anthori found rings philosophically confused but biometric tokens, small and precisely made, that when pressed into the other party's palm would log in the galactic registry and make the union binding across 43 jurisdictions. Marcus held out his hand. Velshari pressed her seal into his palm without looking at him. He accepted it, noting distantly that it was warmer than expected from someone who ran about 3 degrees cooler than baseline human and finely made, with an etching too intricate to read without magnification. He pressed her seal to his palm. Something registered, somewhere in the deep systems of Nexus Station. Treaty Article 7, Section 12 became legally enforceable across 4 quadrants. Binding completed, the officiant announced, to an audience of 7 beings and 1 documentation drone, by the authority of the Galactic Council. under the Interspecies Alliance Accord. This union is recognized across all member jurisdictions. Witnesses, please log your confirmations. Nobody applauded. The audience was not configured for applause. 2 of the 3 council representatives were species that communicated approval through methods Marcus didn't fully understand, and Admiral Ewan communicated it through the very small nod she gave him from across the room, which conveyed approximately the same sentiment as good luck and I am sorry, combined into a single economical gesture. Marcus nodded back. Velshari had already turned to speak to one of her advisors, a quick-moving, perpetually distracted Anthori named Fentali, who seemed to exist in a permanent state of receiving urgent communications from 3 directions simultaneously. Her markings were still blue. He had just married someone who was in precisely the same emotional state as when she had signed a quarterly resource allocation report. He was, he told himself, entirely fine with this. This was the arrangement. This was the stated purpose. He needed to be fine with this. And he was. And he was going to stop thinking about it now. Admiral Ewan appeared at his elbow and pressed a brief, firm grip to his forearm, the closest she ever came to a hug, and said, "You did good. Colonel, I stood still and didn't say anything embarrassing," he said. "Let's not give that too much credit. In this context." Ewan said, "That's the whole job." She held his gaze for a moment. The apology was still in it. Underneath the professionalism, she had been apologizing to him since Kethsarai, in various small unspoken ways, for a thing that wasn't her fault and that he didn't blame her for. "This matters. Marcus, the Council needs this. The Anthori Alliance is the only thing holding 3 other negotiations in place right now. You being here, you specifically. A soldier, not a politician, that matters. I know. Take care of yourself. Always do." He gave her the smile, the convincing one. She walked away with the look of someone who didn't quite believe it. The post-binding diplomatic dinner occupied one of Nexus Station's formal suites for just over 2 hours. Marcus ate something that tasted like compressed sweetgrass and protein, decided not to investigate further, and listened to the Anthori advisors conduct a rapid-fire policy discussion in layered Anthori that his earpiece translated into the flat, functionless English of things like the resource partition clauses remain satisfactory and the documentation schedule appears achievable. At one point, an advisor said something that rendered in his earpiece as, "The human appears adequately groomed." Marcus raised his glass. "Thank you." Velshari, seated to his left, caught it. He saw the precise flicker of her eyes, not to the glass but to his face, and for just a moment the steady blue in her markings shifted toward amber. Warm spectrum. Brief. Gone before he could be certain it had been there. The briefing said amber indicated curiosity, or active cognitive processing, or both. "Do you require something?" she asked. Her English was technically flawless, enunciated with the precision of someone who had learned a language as a system to be mastered rather than absorbed. "Just a toast," Marcus said. "Mutual benefit. Isn't that the stated goal?" "That is correct." "Then here's to it." He drank. She watched him do it with the expression of someone cataloging an unusual behavior pattern. He set the glass down. "I want to say something while we're being formal about things. I know what this is. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And I'm not going to make it difficult. Whatever space you need is yours. Whatever you need to do for the conclave, I'll stay out of the way." Velshari studied him for several seconds. "The way you studied something that wasn't matching your predicted parameters. You are significantly less resistant than we anticipated. Is that a compliment?" "It is an accurate assessment. The treaty requires cohabitation documentation for a minimum of 2 standard years. It does not require." She paused in a way that communicated she was selecting words carefully. "Anything further?" "I understand." "Good." Across the table, Fentali was sending messages on a partially concealed device, screen angled away from Velshari. Marcus noticed because he noticed everything. It was less a skill than a reflex developed over 15 years of environments where noticing things kept you alive. He noted the angle. He noted that Fentali had sent 3 messages since the first course. He filed it in the cabinet his brain maintained for things that weren't immediately important, but might become so. "You've read our species briefings," Velshari said. Again, not quite a question. "All 40 pages. I read 37. Something that might have been the very edge of dry moved through her precision. I did not require the appendix on human dietary restrictions. Smart call. That appendix is depressing. He picked up his fork. We can be awkward about this, or we can be professional. I vote professional. She considered him for another measured moment. Professional, she agreed, and returned to her food with the composure of someone who had never in her life entertained the alternative. They walked to their assigned suites together. Documentation required proximity logging. Same corridor. Brief shared transit and said almost nothing, which was not uncomfortable so much as carefully constructed. Velshari moved with the particular silence of a species that had evolved in environments where noise was a disadvantage. Marcus's footsteps made sound. He was aware of this. He was aware of most things that revealed the specific ways humans were built differently. "What did you do before?" she asked, as they reached her door. Not quite out of nowhere, she'd been building to something for most of the walk. He'd sensed the trajectory, but the directness of it was still a slight surprise. Before the treaty. Before all of it, he thought about what honest looked like in this context. What he'd done, before all of it, was fight. 15 years across 4 theaters of the Krethva border campaigns, rising from lieutenant to colonel through the specific mechanism of being the person who was still standing when the engagement ended. What he'd done, immediately before this, was spend 8 months on administrative leave following the engagement at Keth Sarai, during which he'd consumed enough whiskey to constitute a health concern and been cleared anyway by 3 different medical evaluators, because he'd also produced a tactical analysis of Krethva siege methodology that the Council's Military Advisory Board had used to restructure the entire border defense strategy. What he'd done, in the 7 days between receiving this assignment and boarding the transport, was reread that analysis and wonder if it was the best thing he'd ever leave behind. "Fought," he said. "Mostly." She looked at him. The amber was back, steadier this time. "And now I'm a political anchor." A small, dry smile came automatically. First time for everything. He expected the conversation to end there. Instead, she said, "The Anthori have been at the border negotiations for 14 months. The delay was not the Conclave's choice. There was significant internal opposition to this treaty." She said it the way she said most things. Precisely. Without ornament, as though the information spoke for itself. "You being agreeable makes the next 2 years less computationally complex. Happy to reduce the computational complexity," Marcus said. And then, because it was true, and because something in the way she said the words made him think she deserved the truth in return, "I'm not here to make this hard. Velshari. I don't have an angle. I don't have ambitions that require leveraging a diplomatic marriage. I'm here because the Council asked, and I said yes, and I'll be a good treaty husband and stay out of your way." The amber in her markings did something that the briefing hadn't mapped. A deepening. A settling, that is, she said slowly. Genuinely unusual for a human political representative. "I'm not really a political representative," he said. "I'm a soldier they put in a suit." Something moved across her face. Not an expression he had a name for yet, but something. "Get some sleep," he said. "The treaty will still be binding in the morning." He turned to go, heard, just at the edge of his earpiece's range, her voice low to Fentali Rapid Anthony, too fast to translate, and then one word the translator caught. Unusual. He didn't analyze it. He had a kit bag already packed by the door of his own suite, and 11 minutes later his comm lit up with a priority red alert, and he stopped thinking about weddings entirely. Border incursion. Anthori rim systems. Heavy engagement. Ground command personnel requested. Marcus had his kit bag and was dressed in field gear by the time the second notification came through. He stopped at her door because it was the right thing to do, or at least because it was the kind of thing someone did when they shared a treaty. She opened the door before he knocked. She was still dressed, in something closer to her advisor's attire than the ceremony clothes. She opened the door before he could knock. He held up the bag. "There's a border engagement. I'm volunteering for ground command." Something moved through her markings, not the steady blue, not exactly amber, something between them and below them, cool and measuring and not quite readable. You have been married for 3 hours and 14 minutes, I know. The treaty. Documentation can be filed from the field. If you authorize it. He met her eyes. Her pupils were dark gold with vertical striations, reading as alert, fully present in a way they hadn't quite been during the ceremony. I know what this is. I know what I'm useful for. And it's not standing in a diplomatic station waiting for the 2-year clock to run. He didn't say the rest of it, about the way silence had sounded since Keth Sarai, about the way a fight, even a bad one, even a hard one, was the only environment in which his head went quiet. That wasn't her problem to carry. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. I will authorize the documentation filing. A beat. Marcus. He turned. Her markings were the steady blue again. Whatever he'd seen was gone. Do not get killed. The treaty is significantly more complex to maintain if you die in the first week. I appreciate the concern. It is not concern, she said precisely. It is contractual logic. He laughed, a real one, brief and unguarded, because he hadn't expected that, and he had a weakness for things that were funnier than they were supposed to be. And then he went, because there was a fight and he was needed, and this was the part he knew how to do. Behind him, he heard her tell Fentali something in Anthori Rapid, low too fast for the earpiece. What the translator caught, in the last half-second before range dropped out, was a single word rendered as unusual. He filed it. He had work to do. The transport to the Anthori Rim took 22 hours. Marcus spent most of it reviewing tactical data, eating protein bars, and building a picture of an engagement that had been described in the official briefing as unexpected, but that he recognized, from the specific systems targeted and the pattern of the breakthrough, as a strategic feint. The Krethava had used this approach twice in the border campaigns, a hard push northeast to pull defensive assets away from their actual objective, then a surgical strike south to extract resources from a system they'd had eyes on for a decade. He filed the analysis with the Council liaison, got 90 minutes of sleep, and arrived at Velharat Forward Command Station expecting to walk into a room full of people who didn't want to listen to him. He was not expecting Velshari to already be there. She stood in the command center with 2 advisors and the forward general, in field-adjacent attire, structural Anthori military dress, angular shoulder plating, precision wrist clasps, the kind of thing that didn't count as body armor but communicated clearly that she expected to be taken seriously and was receiving situation reports from 3 officers simultaneously. She looked like she'd been there for hours. When she saw Marcus, she didn't look surprised. The treaty, she said, before he could speak, specifies that the diplomatic envoy may accompany the treaty's represented party in all official capacities. She held his gaze without inflection. You are an official capacity. Marcus looked at her, then at Fentali, already visible in the corner of the room, with what appeared to be a monitoring interface open on his device, not a tactical display, something that was logging rather than analyzing. He filed it. Fair enough, he said. Don't get in my way. The warm amber held for 2 full seconds before she returned to the reports. The tactical briefing that followed involved 7 Anthori commanders, 2 council military liaisons, and a holographic terrain map that everyone was reading in slightly different ways. Marcus sat in the back and listened to them circle the answer for 58 minutes before he requested the floor. He laid out the analysis in 4 minutes flat, the actual target site, the misdirection pattern, the specific window for reinforcing the southern line. He showed his reasoning. He didn't editorialize. The room went quiet in the way that rooms went quiet when someone had just collapsed an hour of work into 4 minutes. General Keth Moran, who had spent the first minute of Marcus's presentation regarding him the way you regarded someone's pet when it began doing unexpected things, said something to his adjutant that Marcus's earpiece rendered as, recalibrate the human assessment to field command capacity. Priority 1. Marcus accepted that as a compliment and accepted command of the ground coordination unit without making anyone feel worse about the preceding hour than they already did. At the edge of the room, Velshari's markings had shifted to warm, sustained amber. She was watching him the way you watched something that had stopped matching your model of it, and you were deciding whether to update the model or keep watching to be sure you hadn't made an error. He looked away. There were positions to fortify, feint to counter-exploit, and about 6 hours before the Krethva figured out their timing had been anticipated. The 6 hours before the engagement moved the way time moved before a fight stretched in some places, compressed in others, sharp at the places where decisions got made and soft in the intervals between. Marcus spent the first 2 hours with the ground coordination team and the next 2 walking the defensive perimeter with Keth Moran's adjutant, Velron, who was far better at listening than most of the senior staff and far less burdened by the assumption that a human couldn't know something worth knowing. It was during the 4th hour that Velshari found him at the edge of the command perimeter, which was not a place she had any tactical reason to be. She stood with her primary arms in the neutral posture and looked at the approach coordinates on his display. And Marcus had the impression she'd been there for several minutes before he'd acknowledged it. "You're going out with the ground team," she said. "Yes. You are the ground command authority. That is not typically a forward position role." "No," he agreed. "But I fight better from the front. I always have." He said it the same way he said most things, simply, without apology. "I need to see what I'm moving." She was quiet for a moment. The markings on her neck were neither cool blue nor amber, something more complex. A layered purple, the briefing associated with conflict between competing priorities. He had the impression she was running several different assessments simultaneously and hadn't finished any of them. "I reviewed your combat record," she said. He looked at her. The full record. The portions the Council made available. 3 commendations for tactical analysis. 2 for adaptive ground command. 1 formal censure for unauthorized engagement in the Pelorum campaign. She delivered this without judgment in the words, though he couldn't rule it out in the assessment behind them. "You survived the engagement at Kethsarai as the sole surviving officer from your battalion." "Yes." "The after-action report attributes your survival to—" She stopped, which was unusual. She did not strike him as someone who stopped mid-sentence often. The Council summary uses the phrase exceptional adaptive response to catastrophic loss. The original report from the unit medic uses different language. Marcus was quiet. "What did the medic say?" she asked. And for the first time, there was something in the question that wasn't cataloging. "Something careful, that I should have been dead and wasn't," Marcus said, "and that the physical indicators didn't match the trauma sustained." He looked back at the display. Medics write what they see. What they see sometimes doesn't make sense. He expected her to push it. She didn't. She stood beside him for a moment that held a particular weight, not comfortable exactly, but not the diplomatic silence of the dinner. Something more like 2 people standing in the same place for a reason neither of them had fully articulated. "Be careful," she said finally. "Contractual logic," he reminded her. Something moved through her markings. Not amber. Warmer than that. She left before he could name it. An hour later, the Krethva feint executed on schedule. Marcus was in position on the southern flank when their actual strike force came in. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. When it was over, the Krethva had failed to reach the resource site. The Anthony defensive line had held with minimal casualties, and Marcus Rowe had absorbed 2 hits that should, according to the field medic who treated him afterward, have removed him from the fight entirely. He had not stopped. Fentali, in the command station, filed a report to a frequency that was not in the standard communication logs, and Velshari, reviewing the field footage at midnight, watched Marcus take a hit that should have put him down and come back up in 3.4 seconds, when the average recovery time for that class of impact in humans was measured in minutes. She watched it twice. Then she sat very still, in the way Anthony sat still when a model had just been overturned, and she did not file her report to Fentali that night. The field medic's name was Corman Das, and he had been practicing emergency medicine on Anthony military personnel for 11 years, which meant he knew exactly what an improperly treated blunt force fracture looked like, what internal pressure bruising looked like, and what a combat survivor who had received approximately 2/3 of a lethal dose of kinetic trauma and then kept fighting for 3 more hours looked like. He had never seen one before. "You need to stay still," Das said, for the 3rd time, in the Anthony pattern of saying things 3 times when the first 2 had not produced the desired result. "I'm still." Marcus said. "You are not still. You are conducting an analysis of the second quadrant breach point while I am attempting to assess whether your clavicular support structure is compromised." Das pressed a scanner along Marcus's shoulder. The readings that came back did not match the readings that should come back from someone who had absorbed the impacts he'd documented absorbing. "This does not make sense." "Which part?" "All of it." Das made the Anthori adjustment sound, a soft click that his translator didn't try to render. "The impact at 342 hours was sufficient to cause a Class 3 skeletal trauma in your species. You did not stop moving. The second impact, at 411, had sufficient kinetic force to cause internal hemorrhage in your thoracic region. The scanner shows bruising consistent with impact, but no active hemorrhage." He set down the scanner. "Your biology should not be doing this. I've always healed fast," Marcus said. He said it the way he said all things he believed to be true, but had never investigated as a simple fact, with no particular weight attached to it. "Ask any of my unit medics. They'll say the same. I would like to speak with them. Most of them are dead." He said that the same way, too, simply. Das observed this and noted it in his report. Velshari stood at the edge of the medical tent, technically outside the patient zone. She had been there for most of the examination. Fentali was beside her with his device and his perpetual air of anxious documentation. And the field medic could feel her attention. Anthori attention had a quality, a focus, that was physically perceptible, concentrated entirely on the man sitting on the examination table who should have needed surgery and appeared to need nothing more than a change of clothes. "How long has this accelerated recovery been documented?" she asked. Marcus looked at her. Something in his expression recognized that the question was not casual. He answered it without making that recognition visible. "Since I was 24, he said. "Kreth engagement near the Helion belt. 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung. The medic wrote in the report that I'd fully cleared in 72 hours. He tilted his head slightly. Took everyone 2 days to believe the imaging wasn't corrupted. Velshari's markings were the processing amber. Sustained. Deep. Interesting, she said, which was the most carefully neutral word she'd produced yet, and which Marcus's brain flagged without his conscious permission as worth examining later. There were 3 more engagements over the next 11 days. The Kreth Va, having failed to execute their primary objective, recalibrated. Not immediately, because Marcus had been right about the patience they were patient, the way species were patient when they were absolutely certain of the outcome, but methodically, the way they always did, with the quality of a civilization that didn't accept the first negative result as meaningful data. They came back with a different configuration. They came back again with a third. Each time, Marcus and the ground coordination team were ready, and each time the outcome was the same. The Anthori defensive line held, the resource site was protected, and the Kreth Va withdrew to reassess. After the third engagement, General Keth Moran held a briefing in which he described Marcus as the most unexpectedly effective ground command asset currently in the Anthori theater, which was the nicest thing anyone had said to Marcus in approximately 8 months, and also technically strange given that he was a treaty husband and not a command asset. I will note, Keth Moran said to Velshari afterward, that the Council's assessment of human military capacity appears to have been based on significantly outdated data. I am beginning to think that. Velshari agreed. She said it with the flat precision she used for most things. But Fentali, who was watching her the way someone watched a variable beginning to deviate from its predicted curve, noted that the amber in her markings had not returned to baseline blue for 3 days. The ruins were in the eastern sector of the engagement zone, partially exposed by the geological disruption the second Kreth Va strike had caused. They were old Das, who had some interest in archaeology as a secondary field, dated them as pre-Anthori settlement, which meant at minimum 40,000 years, and they were marked with a system of etchings that ran along the exposed walls in complex, layered sequences. Nobody knew what language they were. The Council's archaeological liaison, contacted by a curious Velron, confirmed that the etchings matched no known script in the galactic database, which was either anomalous or deeply significant. In Marcus's experience, those 2 things tended to arrive together. He was looking at the eastern wall of the ruins when he realized he was reading it. Not consciously. Not the way you read something you've been taught. The way you read something that your brain already knows, the way he'd always known the tactical geometry of a new battlefield. The way he'd always known which way a fight was going to break before the breaking started. His eyes moved across the etchings, and something behind his eyes parsed them into meaning as naturally as English. He stopped. Read it again. Read it 3 times. The markings said, as nearly as he could translate the translation his own brain was producing. When the consumption comes from the dark between stars, the key turns in the one who has endured enough. The key is not given. The key is made. It is made of loss and fire and the refusal to stop. The carrier will know by the knowing. The carrier will burn. The anchor holds the carrier. Without the anchor, the carrier is only the fire. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the wall and said nothing to anyone. He thought about the words on the walk back to camp. He thought about the consumption and comes from the dark between stars and what that might mean, and whether it had anything to do with the low-level alerts that had been appearing in the Council's classified feed for the past 6 months, the feed he technically shouldn't have been able to access, but which Callisto Station's data architecture had gaps in, and Marcus had always been good at gaps. The alerts referenced something at the galactic rim, something moving inward. Something the Council's language around kept becoming vague in the specific way. Language became vague when the person writing it was afraid of the thing they were writing about. He thought about the key is not given. It is made. He thought about being 24 years old and walking away from a punctured lung in 72 hours. He went back to camp and said nothing to anyone, because he didn't know what he would say, and saying it wrong seemed more dangerous than not saying it at all. That night, in the quiet between the third engagement and whatever the Kreth-Va were planning next, Velshari found him outside the command tent with a mug of something hot that wasn't quite coffee, but worked on the same neurological principle. "You can't sleep either," he said. Not a question. Her shadow had the quality of someone who'd been walking for a while. "Anthori require less sleep than humans," she said. 4 hours is sufficient." She came to stand beside him, looking out at the dark of the rim. The stars here were different, closer spaced. Some of them, and the particular darkness between them, had a quality he couldn't quite name. "But I did not sleep tonight." "What kept you up?" She was quiet for a moment. "I am reconsidering several assessments," she said, "of the tactical situation, of various things." The pause between them was not the silence of the formal dinner or the careful space of the ceremony. It was something else, the particular quiet that accumulated between two people who had been through the same difficult days and were now on the other side of them, and hadn't yet decided what to do with that. "What did the wall say?" she asked. He looked at her. She met his eyes without particular expression. "I watched you at the eastern ruin," she said. "You were reading it." He considered lying, decided against it, not because honesty was always the right policy, but because she was demonstrably not someone you could lie to about things she'd already observed. "I don't know what I was doing," he said. "It felt like reading. I couldn't tell you where the language comes from." "What did it say?" He thought about the words. "Something about an old threat," he said carefully, "coming from outside the rim, and something about a carrier. Someone who gets made into something by what they survive." He kept his voice neutral. "I don't know the context. I don't know if it's literal or metaphorical, or if I was just pattern-matching my way through a wall." Velshari was very still. The markings on her neck had gone to something he hadn't seen before, not the steady blue, not amber, something closer to silver, a color the briefing hadn't covered, that he couldn't read at all. "What did it say about the carrier?" she asked. "That they needed an anchor," he said, "to hold them together when the key turned." She said nothing. After a long moment, the silver dimmed back to amber, and she said, "You should sleep. Marcus, there will be a 4th engagement." "Probably," he agreed. She turned to go. "Stopped the report I filed today," she said. "It was different from the ones I've been filing." He waited. "I described you accurately," she said. "I didn't contextualize. I didn't soften the anomalous elements for logistics purposes." A pause. "I thought you should know." He watched her walk back to the command tent. He thought about what it meant to change the way you reported something. He thought about who the reports were going to. He thought about silver and conflict between what you have been given and what you know to be true. He left it out of the cabinet, where he could look at it. The fourth engagement happened on the 8th day. The Kreth-Va came in a configuration Marcus hadn't seen before, a combined approach, ground and aerial assets in coordination, which told him they'd spent the intervening days seriously reviewing what had gone wrong and making adjustments. It was the kind of adaptation that indicated a species getting ready to escalate past the point of strategic patience. He met it with a counter-configuration he improvised in real time, adjusting the ground team's positioning as the Kreth-Va approach vectors became clear. There was a moment in the middle of it, the kind of moment that happens sometimes in the center of a bad fight, when the geometry crystallized and he could see every line of movement simultaneously, the way a mathematician could see a proof before writing it down, where the entire battle became transparent to him, the outcome visible in advance. He took a hit during this moment. Shrapnel from a Kreth-Va ground unit's secondary weapon, catching him across the upper left arm and into the shoulder. He registered the impact, cataloged it, allocated 3 seconds to the pain, and continued calling the repositioning. Velshari, in the command station, watched the field footage in real time. She watched him take the hit. She watched the 3 seconds. She watched him continue. The silver in her markings returned. Longer this time, Fentali said, quietly, beside her. The Arbiter has requested a communication. Later, she said. He indicated it was time-sensitive. Later, she said again. And she kept watching Marcus Rowe direct the end of the fourth engagement with blood on his sleeve and a clarity in his voice that she'd been trained to recognize as something she had not had a category for when she arrived. She had one now. She just didn't know yet whether having the category was a gift or a warning. The communication from Threkon came through that evening on the private channel she'd been assigned when she accepted this deployment. Threkon's image materialized on the portable display. Tall, gaunt, his 4 Valorian eyes pale and measuring, his white-silver skin carrying the luminescent quality of age. He looked like a being who had spent a very long time thinking about something he did not enjoy. "Envoy," he said. His voice was the kind of quiet that commanded rooms. "Your reports have been thorough. The rate of anomalous recovery events is trending in the expected direction." "Expected by whom?" she said. She kept her voice level. The 4 eyes moved in the slight Valorian pattern, indicating consideration of a question's subtext. "The work has been ongoing for some time," he said. "The carrier profile was identified 31 years ago. The right conditions for activation have required patience." A slight emphasis on the word. "We are approaching a threshold." A threshold for what? For the protocol's full engagement. The genetic pathway we have been monitoring responds to accumulated trauma and loss, to sustained combat engagement past the limits of normal human capacity. Colonel Rowe's pattern at the Anthori rim is producing the stress markers we anticipated. His tone remained controlled, the way a surgeon's tone remained controlled. We will need closer observation data as the markers escalate. Physiological, neurological, specifically his cognitive state under maximum stress, his processing speed, his intuitive capacity for systems he has not been trained on. Velshari was very still, and when the threshold is reached, the pause was 1 second long. The carrier will be retrieved for comprehensive evaluation and controlled activation. Threkon said, "The protocol is too significant to leave to uncontrolled circumstances. When the time comes, we will need the envoy to provide real-time location data to facilitate a clean extraction." His 4 eyes held hers across the transmission. "This has always been the function of this deployment." "Velshari, I trust that is understood." "Yes," she said. "I understand." She ended the communication. She sat for a very long time. The display on the far wall showed the medical tent, where Das was filing yet another anomalous recovery report for Colonel Rowe, who was sitting on the examination table, having the shrapnel removed from his shoulder and arguing, based on what she could hear through the audio feed, that the arm was fine and he didn't need the immobilization sleeve. The word retrieved sat in her chest like a piece of ice she couldn't expel. She called up the treaty documentation on her personal device. Read the terms she had signed. Read the clause about the represented party's rights under council jurisdiction. Then she opened a blank report form and stared at it for 11 minutes without writing anything. She did not write a report that night. She sat with the ice and the word retrieved, and the image of a man who had said, "I don't know what to do with it except use it," and who had laughed, once, briefly and genuinely, at the news that he was contractually irreplaceable. She sat with it until the Anthony rim went quiet and the stars outside were very still, and then she sat with it some more. On the 11th day, the Krethva pulled back. Not a feint. Marcus could read the difference between a tactical withdrawal designed to draw pursuit and a genuine disengagement, and this was genuine. Somewhere between the 4th engagement and the 5th, the Krethva had recalculated and decided the resource site, while valuable, was not worth the accumulating cost. It was, Marcus thought, the most expensive way to lose. They'd have known that going in. The command staff of Velarat spent the first 24 hours after disengagement running verification scans and then running them again. The Krethva were not known for giving up. General Keth Moran convened 3 separate intelligence reviews before he was willing to accept that this particular theater was quiet for the foreseeable future. Marcus accepted it immediately. He'd seen Krethva disengagements before. This one was real. He spent the first quiet day sleeping, which he did better than usual after a fight. The silence afterward was easier to live with than the silence of administrative leave, which had too much room in it. He slept 9 hours, approximately 5 more than his usual average, and woke feeling like a different version of himself, which was both good and slightly disconcerting. The second quiet day found Velshari in the eastern wing of the command station, in a small observation room that looked out over the crystalline formations of the Anthori rim and contained exactly 2 chairs and nothing else. She was sitting in one of them, not working, not reviewing reports, just sitting, watching the light fracture through the crystal formations in patterns that were almost language-like in their regularity. "Is the other one available?" he asked. She looked up. The amber was back, the warm, steady version, but mixed now with something else the briefing hadn't named. "Yes," she said. He sat. The silence between them was different from all the previous silences. The ceremony silence had been constructed, maintained by mutual agreement. The field silences had been purposeful, filled with tactical weight. This one was something he didn't have a category for at first. And then he did. It was comfortable. Not because they had resolved anything between them, but because they had survived the same 11 days, and surviving the same thing left a particular kind of residue that didn't require words. "I read your analysis of the 4th engagement," she said, after a while, "and it is the clearest tactical documentation I have encountered. The Council's board will review it." She turned to look at him. Her pupils were doing what he'd started to think of as the deep focus configuration narrowed. "Tracking. You wrote it in 4 hours. After the engagement, with a shrapnel wound in your dominant arm." "Non-dominant," he said. "I'm right-handed. You should not have been capable of coherent documentation regardless. I'm capable of more than I should be. Usually." He looked out at the crystals. "It's been that way since I was young. I don't know what to do with it except use it." She was quiet. Then, "The medic's report from the first engagement references a previous notation in your record. From the Battle of Kethsarai." He said nothing. He noted that you exhibited combat effectiveness inconsistent with the physical state he documented you in when you were recovered. She kept her voice as neutral as she kept everything, but he could hear the weight behind the neutrality. He also noted that you were the only survivor of a battalion of 47. He noted that this was, statistically, not possible given the engagement parameters. Marcus kept his eyes on the crystals. The light coming through them was blue-shifted, fractured into patterns he found strangely readable, like they were telling him something in a language just below the threshold of translation. 47 good soldiers," he said. "Better than me. Most of them. And yet. He was quiet for a moment. Nobody knows what to do with things like that. So they write exceptional adaptive response and file it, and everybody moves on." He turned to look at her. "Is that what you're doing?" "Filing it." She met his eyes. The amber was very warm. The unnamed color was present in it. "I am attempting," she said. to accurately categorize something that does not fit the categories I was given. Welcome to my life. Something crossed her face that was. He was almost certain. The Anthori version of a smile, a slight compression at the corners of her eyes. A fractional change in the architecture of her expression that added up to warmth without performing it. It is a disorienting life, she said, from the outside. Probably. He looked back at the crystals. Vel Shari. The reports you're filing. Who reviews them? The warmth in her expression didn't vanish, but it changed quality. A shift. They go through standard council channels, she said, and the precision of her voice was fractionally increased. The way a very controlled person's voice became more controlled when something landed near a nerve. He noticed. He filed it, then decided not to file it. "Okay," he said, and left it there. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, and the silver crept back into her markings. That color the briefing hadn't covered, that he'd started to think, meant something like right on the edge of a thing she hadn't decided to say. "The view is good here," he said. "Yes," she said. They stayed for another hour. Nobody said anything significant. But when he got up to leave, and she said his name, and he turned, she said, "The Anthori term for what I showed you last night, the silver in my markings. It is not in your briefing." A pause. "It means conflict between what you have been given to believe and what you are coming to know." He looked at her. "I thought you should have the translation," she said, and went back to looking at the crystals. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went to write his end-of-engagement reports. And he thought about silver and conflict and what you came to know. And he left it out where he could look at it. The file was not hidden. Exactly. That was what she would think about later, that whoever had put it there had been arrogant enough, or simply logical enough, to believe she would never look, and so had not bothered to conceal it properly. The way you don't lock a door in a house where you don't expect visitors. She found it on the 14th day. In the subsidiary data partition of the diplomatic communications device she'd been assigned at the start of this deployment. She had been running a routine maintenance protocol standard procedure. Every 14 days in the protocol surfaced a compressed file in a partition she hadn't known existed. She almost didn't open it. The partition was marked with a council administrative code that usually indicated resource allocation documentation. She would have closed the protocol and moved on. Except that something small and specific about the code string was wrong. A single character transposition that was too precise to be a corrupted entry and too deliberate to be an accident. And she had spent 20 years as a diplomatic envoy developing the instinct for things that were wrong in specific, targeted ways. She opened it. The file was called Godforge Row Activation Log. It had a timestamp from before her deployment. It had her name on it. In the access header, as authorized viewer, she had not known this file existed. She read it in 11 minutes. She spent the next 3 hours understanding what she had read. The Godforge protocol was not recent. The briefing document in the file authored by Thray Khan 31 years ago, and updated regularly since described it as a genetic-level bioengineering achievement of an ancient human civilization, predating the Galactic Council by more than 40,000 years. The Anthori Historical Archives contained no records of this civilization, which the briefing attributed to the Council's systematic removal of such records from the accessible database. Beginning approximately 12,000 years ago, when the Council's founding generation had made a collective decision that this particular piece of history was too destabilizing to leave unmanaged. The reason it was destabilizing, what the protocol did. In certain human bloodlines, a genetic pathway had been engineered into the base code of the species, a pathway that lay dormant unless activated by a specific combination of sustained trauma, combat engagement past normal physiological limits, and significant cumulative loss. Once activated, the pathway functioned as what the briefing called an organic weapons integration system. It rewired the carrier's cognitive and physical processes to operate at a level the briefing described, with what she thought was deliberate understatement, as significantly beyond documented human capacity in all measured categories. It also required something the briefing called an anchor function. Without an anchor, a specific emotional focal point, A person the carrier had formed a genuine bond with. The activation process produced cognitive fragmentation. The carrier's mind expanded past the parameters it could maintain coherently without a point to return to. The Godforge researchers had built this into the design. The anchor was not a flaw. It was the mechanism by which the weapon remained a person. And then there was the section she had to read 3 times before she could look away from it. Subject Row. Marcus J. Bloodline confirmed Godforge carrier. Generation 48 of documented lineage. Estimated probability of successful activation, 94.7% under optimal stress conditions. Deployment rationale. Sustained combat engagement at the Anthori Rim will accelerate activation timeline. Optimal anchor candidate. Diplomatic envoy. Treaty representative. Anthori, by virtue of proximity and extended documented interaction protocol. Envoy to be briefed only on observation requirement. Full protocol classified. She read optimal anchor candidate again, and then she read the last entry in the log, time-stamped 6 days ago, in 3Con's notation style. Stress markers at projected 70% activation threshold. Accelerated engagement pattern suggests timeline advancement of 2-3 weeks. Extraction preparation authorized. Envoy remains operational. Proceed. She sat with this for a long time. What she sat with was the specific architecture of what had been done. Not the facts. The facts were clear, but the construction of it. The marriage had been arranged. She had been chosen not as a diplomat, not as a political asset, but as a biochemical catalyst. A designated anchor for a protocol whose architects were 50,000 years dead and whose administrator was a man she'd reported to faithfully for 6 years. She thought about the word optimal. She thought about the way Fentali had always positioned himself near her when she was near Marcus. The monitoring interface that had nothing to do with standard diplomatic observation. She thought about Thrakan's 4 pale eyes and his certainty unhurried. Absolute that everything was proceeding correctly. She thought about the observation room with 2 chairs and the blue light through the crystals, and a man who had said, "I don't know what to do with it except use it," and who had meant it in the same way she said, "I understand," about things she didn't yet fully understand. She thought about the word extracted. She went to find Marcus. He was not in the command station, the medical tent, the observation room, or any of the places she'd built a mental map of over 14 days. Velron told her Marcus had gone out with a small reconnaissance team to scout the northern approach where the Kreth Va had withdrawn, operating out of range of the station's standard communication array. Out of range. She stood in the corridor for exactly 43 seconds. Then she went to her communications device and looked at the priority channel to Thrakan for a long time, thinking about extraction teams and the word retrieved, and what comprehensive evaluation meant for a carrier who had no idea he was one. She thought about controlled activation, about what the file had said the protocol required, and what it would do to a mind without an anchor that had been allowed to form naturally instead of being manufactured. She thought, "I need to warn him." She thought, "I need to get him out of the field immediately." She sent a recall message to the reconnaissance team's local relay. The relay bounced back out of range. No connection available. Message queued for delivery when connection was established. Estimated delivery 14 hours. 14 hours. She sat in her communications room and felt the shape of a choice she had already made before she knew what the choice was. She had filed reports for 12 days. She had provided location data daily. Fentali had been forwarding everything to Thrakan's network in real time. The extraction team wasn't coming in 14 hours. The extraction team had likely already been dispatched the moment her stress marker reports had crossed the activation threshold. She thought, there is one way to get a recall order to the northern approach in the next 4 hours, and that is to request emergency military support through the command station under a threat assessment, which would require transmitting current known coordinates of all personnel in the field. She thought, that is exactly what Thrakan needs to redirect the extraction team directly to Marcus's position. She thought, if I do this, I am telling them exactly where he is. She thought, if I do nothing, the extraction team will find him anyway, and at least this way there might be military support assets between him and them. She thought, I have 12 days of him sitting in a quiet room and looking at light through crystals, and saying things simply without apology. and laughing at the news that he was contractually irreplaceable. And I thought I knew what I was here to do, and I didn't know, and I know now, and it doesn't matter because the choice is already gone, and I have to choose from what's left. This is the wrong decision. I know it is the wrong decision. I am going to make it anyway because I cannot find the right one fast enough. She sent the coordinates. 5 minutes later, Fen Tally knocked on her door. The Arbiter has acknowledged the update, he said. He paused. He says the team is already on approach. They are ahead of schedule. The ice she'd felt since she read the word retrieved settled into something colder and more permanent. Leave, she said. He left. She looked at the blank display for a long moment. Then she picked up her field kit, picked up her sidearm, and went to find the fastest transport available. She had put them on his path. She was not going to let him face them alone. The northern approach was quiet, in the way battlefields were quiet after something terrible had just finished, being terrible a residual silence. The specific hush of ground that had absorbed violence and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. The Krethve withdrawal from this sector had been real. Marcus confirmed it at 3 separate points, then confirmed it again, because confirmations were free and surprises were expensive. What he was not confirming, because his scanners couldn't categorize it, was the thing the Western approach was doing. He picked it up at 847, a ripple in the energy readings from the forward scanner that the system was logging as atmospheric interference, and that his brain was logging as something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name in his training, but that the part of him that had read the wall recognized with a clarity that moved through him like current. Not Kreth-Va, not anything he'd encountered in 15 years of ground warfare. Something that the ancient wall had called the consumption. Fall back, he said. Velron, who had volunteered to accompany the reconnaissance team, looked at his scanner and then at Marcus. The readings show atmospheric minutes. Fall back, Marcus said. Now, fast. Don't stop. The team moved. They were good Anthori military trained. Responsive. No wasted motion. They moved northwest away from the ripple. And, for approximately 3 minutes, it appeared this would be sufficient. Then the western tree line went dark. Not shadow dark. Empty dark. The light that had been there, scattered and blue-shifted through the crystal structures, simply was not there anymore. As though something had eaten the photons on their way to the world. The formations remained physically present. The light that had been interacting with them was gone. 3 of the 6 reconnaissance team members stopped moving. Keep going, Marcus said, very clearly. Do not look at it directly. Keep. The 3 who had stopped were gone, not dead, not hit, gone, the way a thing was gone when something had taken it so completely that absence was the only word that applied. The crystals where they'd been standing were dark and still. The remaining 3 members of the team ran. Marcus ran with them for 30 seconds and then stopped. He stopped because behind them, the dark was spreading, and ahead of them was the extraction team from Thrakan. He saw them first because he always saw things first. 8 beings in Council Security Configuration Valorian, mostly. With 2 Anthori auxiliaries moving in tactical formation with dampening equipment designed to prevent exactly the kind of early detection his brain performed automatically. They were well-trained, professional. They had been told to extract a human and were executing that order with the quiet efficiency of people who expected the human to be the only thing they had to deal with. They were not expecting what was behind him. Marcus stopped and waited for them to reach him. He stood in the open, which he did sometimes when he wanted to control where a conversation happened. The lead agent, tall, Valorian, 4 eyes like 3 Khans, but younger, raised one hand in the Council halt signal. Colonel Rowe, you're coming with us under Council Directive 7 Alpha. Please do not, there's something behind me, Marcus said, coming from the west. Your dampening equipment is not going to help you with it. You need to hear that before you finish that sentence. The agent looked past him. Marcus watched the 4 eyes track across the western tree line, watched the agent process the absence of light where light should be. Watched the color drain from beneath the Valorian silver skin in a way that meant the agent had been briefed on the something from the west, at least partially, and the briefing had not conveyed it adequately. The unraveling, the agent said, that what you call it. Marcus said. Good. Now listen. I have about 2 minutes before it finishes processing that sector and turns this way. You have 2 options. Option 1. You do this your way. I come quietly, and your team is between me and that thing when it comes. And it eats your dampening equipment and probably your team. And then it eats me before anything useful happens. Option 2, there is no option 2. The agent said. His training was good. The fear in his voice was minimal. Directive 7 Alpha supersedes Option 2, Marcus continued, in the voice he used when he needed people to hear him past their own noise. The voice that had cut through bad briefings and worse situations for 15 years is that you and your team position yourselves in the configuration I'm about to describe, which is going to look like a standard tactical encirclement from the Dark's perspective. And you stay in position for approximately 7 minutes, regardless of what you see or hear. And then it's going to be over. The agent stared at him. It's going to eat 3 of yours before it comes for me anyway. Marcus said, not cruelly. Just the math. At least this way it's purposeful. The agent looked at the Dark, looked at Marcus, made a decision that was either excellent tactical judgment or the particular quality of desperate that produced the same outcomes. Explain the configuration, he said. What Marcus described was not a standard tactical formation. It was something his brain had been building since 847, since the moment the scanners showed him the energy pattern and the part of him that read walls and knew things he had no training for, started parsing the Dark's approach the way he parsed a battlefield, tracking its movement, its hunger, the specific geometry of how it consumed. The extraction team spread to 3 positions, each at a calculated angle to the Dark's approach vector. The positions created 3 separate targets, drawing the Dark's attention in a triangulated pattern. At the center of the triangle, Marcus, the lead agent, said, You understand what you're asking us to do? Yes, and you're standing in the center. Yes. A pause. Why? Because the configuration only works if the center is more interesting to the Dark than the edges. Marcus thought, and because I know in the way I know things I have no training for, that what I have in me is what it's looking for. Because the old wall said the key was made of loss and fire and refusal, and I have had a great deal of all 3. Because, when it comes for the center of the triangle, I am not going to run. Because that's the math, he said. The agent looked at him for a long moment, then at the Dark, which was 200 meters closer than it had been at the start of the conversation. Positions, the agent said. To his team, they moved. Velshari arrived at the edge of the northern field in the fastest transport Velharat had available, which was still not fast enough, which she had known before she boarded it. She had known she would be too late to stop what she had set in motion. What she had not known, what she had not let herself think about during the 22-minute flight, was what too late would look like. It looked like this. 8 beings in Council security configuration, spread across 3 positions in a triangulated pattern she recognized from Anthori tactical theory as an encirclement, but that was oriented strangely, inward rather than outward, a darkness eating the light at the western edge, moving toward the triangle's center, and Marcus Rowe at the center, standing with his arms at his sides and his head slightly tilted, as though listening to something that hadn't reached the audible spectrum yet. She had the field kit. She had the sidearm. She had 14 days of watching a man do things that didn't fit any category she'd been given. And she had the file running through her mind, the 50,000-year-old file, the activation log, the words optimal anchor candidate. And she had 30 seconds from the moment she stepped off the transport to the moment the darkness oriented. It oriented on Marcus. She understood, watching it orient, what the wall's etchings had meant. The consumption that came from the Dark between stars was not metaphor. It was something that had been moving through the space between stellar systems for longer than the current iteration of galactic civilization had existed, eating everything it encountered: matter, energy, signal, photons. The 3 members of the reconnaissance team who were simply absent now in a way she was going to have to carry for a long time. It had been moving toward the inner systems for centuries, and the Council had known, and Thrakon had spent 30 years preparing his answer, and his answer was standing at the center of a triangle. The answer was watching the darkness come. He knew she was there before she reached him. He turned his head a fraction of a degree not toward her directly. Just an adjustment. The way he adjusted to things he'd already catalogued without looking, and said, without raising his voice, "You should be about 200 meters back from my position. I sent them to you," she said. "The extraction team." He was quiet for 2 seconds. "I know. I was trying to get military assets between you and them. I made the wrong. Velshari." His voice was steady, completely steady. The way a gyroscope was steady, not the absence of force, but its perfect management. 200 meters. Please, what are you going to do? He turned to look at her then, fully, for the first time since she'd arrived. And his eyes were. She did not have a word for what his eyes were. She had 20 years of diplomatic training, a precise vocabulary in 4 languages, the instinct for exact description that her species was known for, and she could not find adequate language for what was in his eyes, except to say it had the same quality as the wall etchings, the same quality as the fractured blue light through the crystals, the same quality as all the things she'd watched him do that didn't match the category of human and didn't match the category of anything else either. "I'm going to finish this," he said, "but I need—" He stopped, looked at her with something she could read clearly. The center of it. The part that mattered. "I need a point to come back to. The way the dark works, it doesn't just eat matter. It eats coherence. It eats the signal you send yourself to remember what you are." He held her gaze. "I need something that makes the signal louder than the noise." She understood. She had read the file. She knew what an anchor was. She understood, with the precision of someone trained to understand the structure of things, exactly what he was asking, what it would cost her, and what it meant that she had been placed here specifically for this purpose, that the word anchor in a 50,000-year-old protocol had been converted, by Threekon's planning, into her name and her assignment and 2 chairs in a room with crystal light. She understood all of that. She took 3 steps toward him and said, "I'm here." The darkness entered the triangle. What happened next was not a battle in any classical sense. A battle had 2 sides. A battle had an exchange of force. A battle was something that could be described in a tactical analysis, which Marcus had spent 15 years being good at. This was something else. This was the Godforge protocol engaging with the unraveling at the only interface that existed for both of them, the consciousness of a man who had been made into a key over 38 years of surviving things he shouldn't have, who had read the wall and not known what he'd read, who had stood at the center of the triangle because the math said so, and the math had always been the thing he trusted when nothing else made sense. From the outside visible to Velshari and the surviving members of the extraction team, it looked like Marcus standing perfectly still while the darkness moved around him in a way that wasn't coherent, wasn't linear. Fragmenting, she thought. The way a signal fragmented when it encountered a counter-signal strong enough to disrupt it. The light the darkness had been eating came back at the edges of the triangle. The positions where the extraction agents stood stopped getting darker. The darkness was trying to eat Marcus. The thing it found inside him was trying to eat it back. She could see the cost of it. It was visible in the way he stood, not the still of someone at rest, but the still of someone holding something together with every part of themselves. His hands were at his sides and they were shaking. His jaw was locked. His eyes were closed. Without the anchor, the carrier is only the fire. She moved to him, not to 200 meters. To him, close enough that when she reached out her primary arm, the right one, the one she'd crossed against herself at the ceremony, she could touch his arm. She did. She did not say anything. The briefing had not mentioned words. His shaking stopped, not immediately, gradually, the way a signal found its source, settling toward the frequency it was looking for. The darkness contracted. She watched it happen in real time. It pulled back from the triangle's edges, from the agents, from the absent places where 3 people had been, and concentrated inward on Marcus, and on the thing inside Marcus that was meeting it, force for force, coherence for coherence. The unraveling fractured, not exploded. Fractured the way a thing fractured when its own coherence failed. When it encountered something running the same process, it was running and running it better. The dark scattered. The light came back all at once. Marcus opened his eyes. He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. He looked like someone who had just returned from a very long distance through very difficult terrain and found the destination surprising. "You didn't go to 200 meters." He said, "No," she said. "Why?" She kept her hand on his arm. "Because," she said, and chose the precise words. "I did not want to be at 200 meters." He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. The thing that happened in his expression didn't have a name in any briefing she'd read. And she didn't need the briefing. Then he looked past her. At the field, where the extraction agents were slowly lowering their weapons and checking their scanners with expressions of being significantly outside their prepared parameters. At the places where 3 people were not. At the darkness that was no longer darkness, only crystal and light and quiet. "It's not dead," he said. "What I just stopped." His voice was careful. "That was a piece of it. The advance element. The main body is still out there. It's going to learn from this and come back adapted." "I know," she said. He looked at her. She hadn't released his arm. "How much do you know?" "Enough," she said. "I found the file." The silence between them was brief and very full. "How long?" he said. 14 days for some of it. "All of it this morning." He nodded. His eyes went to the extraction team, to the sky where the darkness had been and wasn't. He looked like a man doing calculations that had nothing to do with numbers. "Threkon," he said. "Yes." He designed all of it. "The marriage." "You." "The whole?" "Yes." "And you're—" He looked at her hand still on his arm. "What are you right now?" "I am," she said, "trying to determine what I am right now." He nodded. The lead extraction agent was approaching. Behind her, she heard more transports, Velharat military assets, scrambled by the alerts that had been going out during the engagement. "The main body," Marcus said. Quietly, "it's going to come back. Adapted. It learned from this encounter." "When?" "I don't know. Days, maybe less." He looked at his hands. The shaking had stopped, but something else had taken its place, a quality she couldn't name immediately. And then she could. Resonance. Like he was running at a frequency he hadn't run at before and hadn't yet assessed the implications of. "I don't know what I just did. I know I can't undo it." "No," she said. "You can't." She released his arm. He looked at her with an expression she had no category for at all, which had stopped happening to her when she was approximately 12 years old, and which was clarifying and frightening in equal measure. "Velshari," he said, "I'm sorry for what he did. Using you like—" "Don't," she said. "Not now." She looked at the approaching extraction agent and then back at him. "There is a conversation we are going to have about all of it. But not now. Now there is a main body of the unraveling still moving through the galactic rim, and a team of council agents who have just witnessed something they will report to Threkon. And there is work to do," he said. "Work to do." The extraction agent reached them. He looked at Marcus with the expression of a very professional being who was significantly outside his prepared parameters. "Colonel Rowe." "My instructions." "Your instructions," Velshari said, and the authority in her voice was the kind that didn't get questioned 20 years of it. Earned and precise and deployed now in a way her superiors had not intended, are superseded by the tactical situation this team just witnessed. I am the senior council diplomatic representative present, and the situation is under active review. She looked at the agent steadily. We need resources, not extraction resources. Defense resources. Full inventory of all council and Anthori assets within 3 quadrants of the rim. She looked at Marcus, and he needs the Anthori weapons array engineering team. The agent looked at her. He looked at Marcus. He calculated the odds of the alternative. "What do you need?" he said. The main body of the unraveling arrived in 31 hours. Marcus had said days, maybe less, and he'd been right, which had stopped being a surprise to anyone in the room. The forward scanner array at Velharat picked up the approach 14 hours before it reached the atmospheric boundary of the Anthori rim, which was enough time to mount a response and not quite enough time to feel prepared for it. Threkon's communication came through at hour 12. Velshari took the call in the command center with Marcus standing to her left, which Threkon had not anticipated. She could see it in the microscopic recalibration of his 4 Valorian eyes, a very controlled person's very controlled surprise. "Envoy," he said. His voice was the same as always. I see the initial engagement was partially successful. The advance element was neutralized, Velshari said. Yes, and the carrier. The four eyes moved to Marcus, and what moved through them was complex, not hostility exactly, but a very specific quality of worry. The worry of someone who had spent 30 years afraid of two things simultaneously, and was now watching both of them exist in the same room. Colonel Rowe appears functional. I'm here, Marcus said. His voice was level. You want to explain your plan to me? I've had some time to work through it. I have questions. Thrakon was quiet for 2 seconds. The protocol, I know what the protocol is, Marcus said. More or less. I'm asking about the part after. The extraction, the controlled activation. He held Thrakon's gaze across the transmission without blinking. What happens to me after I'm useful? The four eyes were very still. I understand why you did it. Marcus continued. His voice was not angry. It was the voice he used for math, for things he'd assessed and accepted because they were true and needed to be acknowledged as true before anything else could move forward. The unraveling is real. You needed something that could engage it. You found the right bloodline, constructed the right conditions, manufactured the right anchor to make the activation stable. 30 years of work. He paused. I'm asking what happens after the work is finished. The protocol, Thrakon said carefully, is an inherently unstable configuration in a biological host. After activation at full scale, the long-term, tell me what happens. A pause. The process is not designed for indefinite continuation in a single carrier. Thrakon said, the original researchers constructed the protocol as a terminal deployment mechanism. He said it the way surgeons said things they believed were true and necessary and regrettable in that exact order. You would have been given every comfort, every resource. You would not have suffered. But I would have died. You would have completed the function you were designed for. Thrakon said, and she heard in it what he meant to him. These were the same statement. And more than that, she heard in it 30 years of believing that this was the most humane version of a terrible necessity. I did not create this situation. Colonel Rowe, I did not build the unraveling or the protocol. I inherited both and have spent 30 years trying to manage an outcome that preserves as much as possible, except me, except one person. Thrakon said, against the continuation of everything else. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Velshari watched the stillness of enormous assessment happening inside a motionless body. I have a different plan, Marcus said. The main body arrives in 14 hours. Thrakon said, you do not have time for a different plan. I have 14 hours, Marcus said, which is more time than I've usually had. He looked at Velshari. She nodded. We're going to need the Council's full defense asset list for everything within 3 quadrants of the rim. And I need 2 hours with the Anthori Weapons Array engineering team. Thrakon looked at Velshari. His 4 eyes held hers with the weight of 6 years, and everything she had not known to question, and everything she had chosen when she'd gotten on the transport to the northern field instead of staying at 200 meters. Envoy, I ask you to consider your duty. I am considering it, she said. I am reconsidering what it requires of me. She ended the call. 14 hours were not enough and had to be enough, and were. Marcus worked the way he'd always worked, with absolute clarity, with the capacity to hold a complex system in his head and adjust it in real time, with the instinct for the geometry of a fight that had made him useful in 15 years of the wrong kinds of wars, except that the part of him that had been built for exactly this was now awake, and the difference was measurable in the specificity of what he could see. He was no longer sensing the shape of an engagement. He was reading it. Velron, who had survived the northern field and returned to Velharat with the quality of commitment that happened in soldiers after an impossible shared experience, served as his primary liaison to the Anthori command staff. The extraction team's lead agent, Torin, whose entire professional self-concept appeared to be rebuilding from the ground up, in real time served as his liaison to the Council defense assets. What Marcus was building was not a defensive configuration. A defensive configuration against something that ate matter and energy was a way to lose more slowly. What he was building was an engagement model, a geometric argument, as he called it in the briefing, which Velron looked at for 30 seconds and then said, quietly, that it made sense. Instead of presenting a line for the darkness to eat through, he was constructing a situation in which the unraveling would come to a specific place for specific reasons and find, at that place, the thing inside Marcus that it had found at the northern field, except this time at full scale, the full main body, not an advance element. "You're using yourself as bait again," Velshari said. At hour 10, in the brief interval when the plan was set and the assets were positioned, and there was nothing left to do except wait, which was always when the shape of things became most visible. "I'm using myself as the instrument," he said. "That's different. The distinction is subtle from where I'm standing. Bait is passive," he said. He looked at her. "I'm not passive." She accepted this with the precision she accepted most things carefully, holding it against everything she'd learned and adjusting the picture. The thing she was adjusting was not the tactical model. "The anchor function," she said. "You'll need it again." "Yes, the same configuration as the northern field." He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know. This is bigger." The advance element was a probe. The main body as he stopped, reaching for words that weren't quite there. "It's not one thing. It's distributed. A cognition spread across a very large space. Engaging it won't be the same as the northern field." "What will it be like?" "Louder," he said. "More. The signal it sends, the thing it does to coherence, it'll be at a different order of magnitude." He met her eyes. "I don't know if I can hold the signal back to a point the anchor can reach." She understood. The advance element had required partial activation. The main body would require full, and the full activation of the Godforge protocol, Thrakon's briefing had noted, had never been successfully tested in a living carrier. The ancient researchers had designed it. They had never had a main body to test it on. "What do you need from me?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. In the command center around them, Velron and Torin were running final coordination checks, their voices low and steady. Outside the windows, the defense assets were in position. 14 hours of work had produced something that looked, to Velshari's trained assessment, like the most unconventional military configuration she had ever seen, which she had decided to interpret as a sign that it was probably correct. "I need you to stay with me," Marcus said. "However loud it gets, however different I sound. I need you to hold the signal even when I can't tell you what the signal is anymore, because I'll have gone past the place where I can name it." He looked at her with the expression from the command center, the one from underneath everything, the one he'd been keeping in a cabinet for 38 years. "I need to know there's a way back, no matter what I look like on the way through." She sat with this. She sat with what he was asking, with what it meant, with the specific weight of standing here at the end of 14 days, and everything the file had told her, and everything the file had not told her. She thought about being placed here as a function. She thought about what it had become instead. She thought about silver markings and conflict between what you have been given to believe and what you are coming to know. "Marcus," she said. He looked at her. "I spent 14 days believing I was here to observe you," she said. "I was wrong about that. I have been wrong about a great number of things during this deployment, and I intend to address most of them at length when this is finished." She kept her gaze level and precise, holding the important thing the way she'd been trained to hold important things. "I did not come to the northern field because it was my function. I came because you were there, and you were about to face something alone that I had accelerated, and I was not willing to allow that. I sent the coordinates, and then I got on the transport, and I went." A pause. "That is not the behavior of someone performing a function. I have been attempting to find the accurate word for what it is instead." He was very still. "I have not found it yet," she said, "but I know what I am not going to do, which is leave the signal. Whatever form you are in when this is over, you come back to here." She reached over and put her hand on his arm. "The same place, the same pressure as the northern field. I will be here." He looked at her hand on his arm for a moment. Then he looked at her face. Something happened in his expression then, the warm thing. Without management, without the dry smile standing in front of it. All of it, with nothing in the way. "Okay," he said, in the voice of someone who had just made a decision he was going to keep. "Then let's finish it." The unraveling arrived at hour 14 precisely, and the word "arrived" was not adequate. It didn't arrive. It came, the way a tide came, not appearing but being suddenly. irrevocably present, the edge of something that had been moving for a very long time and was now here. The forward scanner array logged it at 347 hours as a wavefront 300 kilometers across. Moving at a speed the instruments registered and flagged as physically implausible. And for 7 seconds every alarm on Velharat station went off simultaneously, and then went quiet in the specific way. Things went quiet when the magnitude of the incoming event exceeded what the alert systems had been calibrated to communicate. The defense assets engaged on Marcus's signal. The configuration he'd built did not try to stop the unraveling. Nothing the Anthori rim could mount was going to stop it, and he had said this clearly and without apology in the planning briefing at hour 3. What the configuration was designed to do was argue with it geometrically to create a structure that pointed the darkness toward a specific place, channeling its attention the way a lens channeled light. The specific place was the field east of Velharat station. Velshari was there when the defense assets launched. She had not been asked to stand there. She had not announced that she was going to. She had simply been in the field east of the station when the darkness came. And when Torin had started to say envoy, "You need to move to the designated," she had looked at him, and he had not finished the sentence. The unraveling hit the outer edge of the configuration at 411 hours. The defense assets did what they were designed to do, not harm, but argue, and the darkness adjusted. Contracted, oriented. Velron, on the command station sensors, tracked the orientation vector and said, to no one in particular, "It's looking at him." It was looking at him, and it had learned. The advance element had been probing, feeling for the shape of what it encountered. The main body had processed what the advance element found and adapted. It didn't come straight at Marcus. It came at the geometry of the situation, adjusting around the defense assets the way water moved around obstacles, finding the channels between them, collapsing the configuration from the inside out. 2 of the Anthori weapon arrays went dark. Not damaged, not hit silent. The power simply gone, absorbed. 3 assets on the left flank dropped out of communication. Then 2 more on the right. Threken's voice came over the command channel. "Row, the configuration is failing. The protocol must be initiated at full engagement. Now, I'm authorizing the removal of the envoy from the field," Marcus said. Into his comm, "Thray, Khan, stay out of this. The survival probability for the envoy in a full activation radius. She knows the odds." Marcus said. "She chose anyway." He looked at Velshari. She nodded. "Full engagement." "Colonel," Thrakan said, and his voice had gone beneath control to something underneath, controlled the sound of a 30-year plan reaching its final moments, and his only remaining question being whether the one variable he'd never been able to fully account for was going to destroy everything else. Now, before the darkness hit them, not the edges, not the outer margin, the center, all at once. The way a system came apart, when enough of its structure had been removed, it collapsed inward and arrived everywhere simultaneously. And the light was gone, and the warmth was gone, and the specific geometry of being a coherent thing in a coherent universe became very abstract very fast. Velshari held the signal. She held it the way she held everything important. Precisely, without dramatics, with the full and deliberate deployment of everything she was. She was Anthori, 20 years of training in maintaining clarity under conditions designed to obscure it. She had 14 days of calibrating to the specific frequency of Marcus Rowe, the dry voice, the managed smile, the laughter he hadn't expected to produce, the way he sat in quiet rooms and said true things simply and without apology, the way he'd said okay and meant it as a commitment. She held all of it. She made it the loudest thing. Marcus burned. She could feel it through the anchor connection, not physically, but in the way the file had described and the way the file had profoundly, not adequately described. She could feel the scale of what was engaging at the center, the enormous, terrible expansion of a system that had been built specifically to meet something like the unraveling the fire of it, the consuming clarity of a protocol designed 50,000 years ago by people who had known this moment was coming and had written their answer into the genetic code of a species that hadn't existed yet. She could also feel the part that was still Marcus. It was smaller than the fire, much smaller, a specific, Individual frequency she'd spent 14 days learning to recognize. It was oriented toward her, and she did not let go. The darkness and the fire met at the center of the field east of Velarat Station, and the mathematics of it were beyond anything any instrument at any installation in the Anthori Rim had been built to measure, and it was going the right way. And then it wasn't. She felt the trajectory shift before any sensor logged it. The main body of the unraveling was not an advance element. It was 300 years of movement and accumulation and everything it had consumed along the way. And it was larger than anything the protocol had been designed to face in a single carrier. And the fire, vast and real, and exactly what Godforge was supposed to produce, was not sufficient. The configuration was failing. She had approximately 30 seconds before the mathematics resolved against them. She thought about the file. The anchor holds the carrier. Without the anchor, the carrier is only the fire. She thought about what the file had not said. What the file had not said was that the anchor was passive. What the file had not said was that the anchor held the carrier through simple proximity and emotional presence alone. And what she understood now, standing here in the dark with her hand on his arm, and the fire running through the connection between them, was something the Godforge researchers had built in and Thrakon's briefing had not emphasized. She was not a stabilizer. The anchor was an amplifier. She did not have the protocol in her bloodline. She was Anthori, and the protocol was human, and there was no genetic mechanism by which she could share the fire. But she had something the protocol's designers had understood even when they couldn't have known her name or her species, something that worked only if it was real, only if it had been allowed to form the way real things formed, without being manufactured, without being installed. The Godforge researchers had known this. Thrakon had known this. In his way, he'd known the anchor had to be real, which was why he'd built an extended proximity protocol and called it a marriage. He had understood the mechanism. What he had not understood could not have factored in, because it was the one variable that could not be controlled, was the direction it would run. He had built a structure for containing a weapon. What had grown inside the structure was not containable. She found the signal, the specific, individual, irreducible frequency of Marcus Rowe, underneath the fire, and she did not hold it. She pushed. She pushed with everything she had and everything she'd spent 14 days becoming, and with the wrong decision she'd made and come back from, and with the moment he'd laughed in the corridor and the moment he'd sat in the observation room saying true things simply, and with the specific way he'd looked at her 30 seconds ago when he'd said okay in the voice of someone making a commitment. She pushed with the fact that she had chosen this, not been placed here. Chosen. The fire doubled, the unraveling fragmented. Not partially. The way the advance element had scattered on the northern field, fully a coherence failure so total and immediate that the sensor arrays at Velharat registered it as a null event for 3 seconds. The instruments logging nothing at all because the instruments had not been built to log the simultaneous cessation of 300 years of continuous movement. The light came back. All of it. Everywhere. At once. Velshari became aware that she was on her knees on the field east of Velharat and did not know when she had gone to her knees. Marcus was on the ground. She found him before she looked. The same way you found a signal you'd been holding. She felt the contraction of it, sharp and sudden as a caught weight, and she moved toward it, and she put her hand on his face and said his name once, clearly. He opened his eyes. She checked. She did not know exactly what she had feared finding, but she checked, and they were the same eyes, dark and tired and currently running some kind of assessment, and she exhaled something she'd been holding for 31 hours. "You're here," she said. "You pushed," he said. His voice was raw, the way a voice was after a fire. "Yes. How? I don't know." She looked at him. He was lying on the ground of the Anthori Rim in the returned light, and behind him the defense assets were rebooting, and Velron was audible on the command channel running status reports in rapid Anthori, and Torin was running verification scans with hands that were not entirely steady. "I think I learned it from you." He looked at her for a long moment. He reached up and put his hand over hers, the one that was still on his face. "Velshari," he said. "Yes, I need to tell you something." She waited. "I have been—" He stopped. The raw voice was careful, choosing words the way someone chose footing on difficult ground. For a long time, I have been treating my life as something I was spending, not something I was keeping. Every deployment, every engagement I've been subtracting." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the weight of what he was saying. Not because she had any way to read human physiology, but because she had 14 days of learning to read him specifically. "I don't think I want to do that anymore. I think I want to keep it." She looked at him on the ground of the Anthori rim in the returned light, and she thought about everything the file had said and everything it hadn't, and everything she'd been given to believe, and everything she'd come to know, and the words she'd been developing for the thing that had no name yet in any of her 4 languages. "That is," she said, "very good news. You think, I think," she said, "that keeping it will be significantly more interesting than spending it." He looked at her with a warm thing, without management. "Yeah," he said, "I think so too." Thrakon submitted himself to the Galactic Council's review board 6 days later. He did not contest the summons. She had not expected him to. Thrakon was many things, but he was not someone who abandoned his accounting when the time for it came. He walked into the chamber with a particular quality of stillness that belonged to someone who had decided the outcome and was prepared to be present for it. The Council faced with the revelation of the Godforge Protocol, the 31-year monitoring operation, the unauthorized deployment of an extraction team under classified directive, and the systematic suppression of the Unraveling's existence from the public record of 17-member civilizations, convened an extraordinary session that was, in the assessment of all observers, the most significant proceeding the Council had undertaken in its recorded history. Velshari submitted her own testimony, 17 pages, precise. She did not soften the elements pertaining to her own role, the observation protocol she'd participated in before she understood what it was, the reports she'd filed, the coordinates she'd transmitted in the wrong decision. She included it all. She also did not simplify Thrakon's motivations into something easier to condemn, because that was not what accurate testimony required, and because she had understood, since she read his file, that he had been afraid. He had loved the galaxy in the specific way that people who were afraid of losing things loved them, by controlling them so thoroughly that the loving and the managing became indistinguishable from each other. The board could determine what that meant. The board's job was judgment. Hers was accuracy. The board's preliminary finding was that Thrakon had violated Article 14 of the Interspecies Alliance Accord and 7 additional clauses they did not need to enumerate in the finding. The deliberate suppression of the Unraveling's existence from the public record of member civilizations constituted a category of harm the board was still constructing adequate language for. The proceedings would take approximately 2 years. Thrakon would be present and conscious for all of them, which she suspected was the element he found most significant, because Thrakon had always understood that the real cost of anything was what it required you to face about yourself. She filed her final diplomatic report for this deployment on the 8th day. In the field of mission outcome, she wrote, completed. In the field of assessment of represented party, she wrote, significantly exceeds initial parameters. In the additional notes field, she wrote nothing, because some things were not for reports. On the 19th day after the engagement, Velshari found Marcus in the observation room, the one with 2 chairs and the crystal light, and sat down. He was awake. He had been sleeping more than usual since the engagement, which Das described as a calibration process and Marcus described as his brain arguing with him about what it was going to be when it grew up. He was sitting with his mug, and the particular quality of fullness she had learned to distinguish from absence, the state of thinking about something too large for the room to contain. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Different," he said. He considered. "The same. Both. Accurate. The analysis capability is." He moved one hand slightly, looking for the word. Louder. More than it was. "I can see things I used to sense. Tactics. Patterns. Geometric relationships in systems. I did the full Krethva sector analysis last night in 40 minutes. It would have taken me a week before." He said it the way he said all difficult truths, simply because they were true. "Das says the genetic pathway doesn't deactivate," she said. "It modulates. He believes you'll find a sustainable level. I'll be different than before." "Yes." He looked at her. "Is that—" He stopped. The managed version almost appeared, and then didn't. Is that okay? She held the question with the seriousness it deserved, the same way she held all important things. You are asking, she said carefully, whether I intend to stay. Yeah, that, she said, is an easy question. She looked at the crystals, at the blue fractured light, at the specific quality of the Anthori rim on a morning that was quiet and bright and contained no operational emergencies for the first time in 19 days. The treaty requires documented cohabitation for a minimum of 2 standard years. She let that sit for a moment. I would like to renegotiate the terms. He looked at her. What kind of renegotiation? I would like the 2 years to not be the minimum, she said. She chose the word. I would like them to be ongoing, without a review clause. The warm thing happened in his expression. All of it. This time. That's a significant departure from the original terms, he said. I am aware. You'd be signing on to... He gestured at himself. At everything the gesture contained the different and same. The fire and person. The thing he was still becoming. This, I know what I am signing on to, she said. I have read the file. I have watched the process. I understand the parameters. He was quiet for a moment, with the look of someone who was about to say something and was deciding whether the moment was right and deciding it was. The anchor, he said. It only works because it's real. The file says that. Yes. It stopped being a function a long time before I knew what it was. Yes, she said. I know. He reached into his pocket something small and precise, something she recognized. And her chest did something she did not have a word for yet, but was developing one for, and he pressed her seal into her palm, the one she'd given him on Nexus Station, the one he'd kept. He pressed it to her palm. The gesture reversed from the ceremony. Different weight. Then I'd like to renegotiate the terms, he said. Also. She looked at the seal in her hand, the etching too intricate to read without magnification. She had, in fact, read it. She had not told him what it said. What it said, in high Anthori register, was to the one who is worth the knowing. Her family had used that seal for 11 generations. It was the seal you pressed into the hand of something real, and she had used it at a ceremony she'd believed was a transaction, and she was going to have to think about what that meant about the things you knew before you knew them. She closed her hand around it. Good, she said. Then it's settled. Outside the observation room, the Anthori rim was bright and quiet, and the light came through the crystal formations, in blue fractured patterns, that didn't look like any written language she'd been trained to read. But she was beginning, slowly, to understand them.